Page 94, the Private Eye podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Page 94. My name's Andrew Hunter-Murray and I'm here in the Private Eye office with Helen Lewis, Adam McQueen and Richard Brooks. We are here to discuss a brand new year of news, which happens to feature lots of things that happened an enormously long time ago, but have now burst back into the national consciousness, starting with the Post Office, because the new series, Mr. Bates versus the Post Office, has gone out and has attracted an enormous amount of attention. Richard, you obviously have been writing about the Post Office for many, many years. I did have a look. We did a Post Office special on this podcast in 2020 where we started off by saying, well, this is a very, very long-running and old story, because that at that point was 2 decades old from the first rash of people being, investigated, sub-postmasters and mistresses. It was, I think, Private Eye and Computer Weekly who were the first publications to write about this.
Yeah, Computer Weekly was the first one in 2009. Alan Bates went to them and a couple of other people came forward. And then Nick Wallace, who was working for a BBC regional news programme, he picked up a couple of cases, including Joe Hamilton, who was one of the lead characters in the drama. Monica Dolan played her, because there was a bit of a cluster in the southeast, Surrey, Hampshire. James Arbuthnot, the MP, was Joe Hamilton's MP. So that sort of got the ball rolling a bit. And Nick said to us, surely this looks like something Private Eye ought to be interested in. And it certainly was. Because for years, as you say, we'd been writing about these dodgy computer programs, including the precursor to Horizon, which was something installed by the Department of Social Security, as it was, to make benefits payments through the Post Office. The whole thing was a complete crock of what, wasted about 700 million quid. Public Accounts Committee said this is the worst thing we've ever seen in an IT program, and that's before the scandal started.
Right.
So the government decided, the new Labour government decided they're going to salvage something from this. They didn't just look at it and think, oh dear, maybe start again. They said, no, we're going to salvage something from it. And then they pushed it through and it became the Horizon system. And from the outset, 1999, it was known to be absolutely plagued with problems.
I watched the first episode of Mr. Bates versus the Post Office, and I think that, there's a kind of upset in the way that people are suddenly tuning into this when people have been plugging away at it for 2 decades. But I think that the drama does a really good job of making you feel the little guy problem of it. The people who sat there and they tried to do everything right. Maybe they got the auditors in because they didn't understand it, and just being confronted with this black, hole of a computer system. And then one of the nicest notes that they have is, and I don't know if this is true, Rich, maybe you can tell me, the Post Office auditors, when they turn up, the internal Post Office police, sort of roll up in a fleet of Mercedes every time. There's a lot of money behind the Post Office. And when the guy from Bridlington, he's done for about £20,000 worth of discrepancy, he's also then ordered to pay over £300,000 in costs for the Post Office. So there is a real David and Goliath aspect to it that I think the drama brings out really well.
Yeah, it brings out this sort of contempt for the little people. These were all, ordinary working class people without particularly loud voices. And when they started saying, look, there's a problem here, it was much easier just to fob them off. Any investigation of it would have revealed a bigger problem. They knew that. But, such was the contempt they had for these people, they thought they could just ignore them, and that their personal, ruining their lives was, secondary to protecting the reputation of the Post Office. And that, in fact, was a line that Paula Venables, who became chief executive of the Post Office, that she used when she went before Parliament. She was, put in a corner. She just said, well, this is about protecting the reputation of the Post Office. When, no, there's sort of reputations of thousands of people being accused of theft to think of too.
One of the things I found so extraordinary about it was the amount of authority that was actually given to the Post Office. And they could bring their own prosecutions.
Yeah, well, that goes
Who
back...
gets to do that?
Well, that goes back hundreds of years. That goes back to sort of protecting the King's mail.
Could this whole thing have been avoided or dealt with much earlier? I mean, obviously it could, but I was reading a bit about it. So in 2012, the Post Office launched a review and mediation scheme, and they hired an accountancy firm called Second Sight to look into the claims that were being made. Second Sight looked into this, and it became pretty clear to them what was going on. They published an interim report which revealed there were big concerns about Horizon. Yeah. So the Post Office stopped their work in 2015 and closed down the mediation scheme.
Yeah.
It feels like that would have been a great time for all of this to be dealt with and resolved nearly a decade ago.
Yeah, absolutely. It should have been. That work should have been seen through. That should have then been scrutinised.
Wasn't it? Just the same thing, same institutional wall?
Second Sight were getting near to the heart of the matter, and that was the problem. That's when they had to be called off. And Paula Venables told them not just to stop their work, but to hand over all the papers that they'd acquired. And I think it was outrage over that eventually led to the litigation instigated by Alan Bates and the 555 sub-postmasters who took the post office to court, and gave them a right trouncing at the end of 2019, which is when we wrote the long special report, which we still have on the website, summarising the story.
I think the other thing that comes out very strongly from the drama, I don't know if this is your experience too, Richard, is that the extraordinary character of Alan Bates, who is just, there's pictures of him like taking all his box files up to the attic, and he kept all his records, and he refused to sign off the accounts, right? Unlike lots of the other post officers who assumed they'd made the mistake and then manually balanced the accounts, he went, I don't believe this, there's something wrong with the computer system, and he never wavered in that. And he seems to be like most whistleblowers, a very unusual type of person. To be that kind of whistleblower or somebody who's a campaigner like that, you have to have almost a kind of monomaniacal focus on it. You have to be a slightly obsessive person in a really useful way. But he's written to you, hasn't he, since the drama came out?
Yeah, somebody got in touch with us, and I just put them in touch with Alan. And, he sent a lovely note back saying, thanks for all the eye has done over the years. It was important in keeping it in the public eye, in the national public eye. But yeah, his character, he is amazing. He's absolutely amazing because he's such a modest, unassuming man, but also so determined, and kept his good humour throughout somehow. I was saying earlier that I think, when Paula Venables is stripped of her CBE, it will be, Alan ought to take her place on the role, a sort of one out, one in type principle.
I don't want to make
possibly a K.
He should get a K, shouldn't he? I mean, if they can put him in the House of Lords, I mean, that would devastate the rest of them, which would be good fun. We're talking, at the moment, the petition about the CB has reached over 1 million signatures already. My sense is that people like David Davis have got their claws into the idea of the private prosecutions. I just don't know whether or not that will be allowed to continue, the post office being allowed to do private prosecutions. But does it feel like things are now moving and changing?
I think so. I think there is a window, as they say, that something could be done. There could be big changes. It was obvious, 10 years ago that the post office shouldn't be doing its own prosecutions. This was one of the problems. It was investigator and prosecutor. And lots of prosecution specialists looked at it and said if the Crown Prosecution Service, an independent prosecutor, had looked at these cases, they simply wouldn't have gone forward. So that might have dealt with the prosecution problem at the start. I think that will get addressed. The other big thing is the overturning the outstanding convictions. There have been 93 overturned so far, and probably another 600 or so to go, which means it could take a long, long time.
People keep talking about that as though it's possible to just wave through a block book of 600 overturned convictions. Is that possible or desirable or not for any reason?
I don't know. I mean, I suspect there'll be a lot of lawyers who won't be too impressed by that idea. Right. Of the people who've appealed so far, there have been quite a lot of convictions upheld as well, which sort of gone slightly unnoticed.
Okay.
50-odd convictions upheld.
Right.
Whether they should have been or not, who knows? But, it's not an easy process getting a prosecution overturned. The courts are very reluctant to say that juries have got it wrong.
Presumably, in terms of the compensation claims, that full legal process has to be gone through and the conviction overturned before you can even start talking about that. Is that the reason for the long delays on?
I don't know. I think you can have interim payments, but on the case, with the overturned convictions, if it's compensation for being wrongfully convicted, then that has to happen. That's why there are only, I think it's 20-something people who've had convictions overturned who have had their compensation at the moment.
It just seems extraordinary. I'm reading the stuff you've written about it. It just reminds me of that other, even longer running case, I think, which is the contaminated blood scandal, which, is also the subject of this enormous public inquiry. And we're talking about, that one goes back all about, I think the first thing that was written in the eye about it was sort of 1986 or 1987 or something. Yeah. And it just seems absolutely extraordinary. And in that case, the really cynical view on that one is that these are mostly, the ones who are still around are very, very unwell people, and they're just trying to play it out for as long as they possibly can.
Yeah. Well, there's... you could be equally cynical about this. Last time we looked at the figure, it was 60 people who died having been victims of the Horizon IT scandal without getting any compensation. So that, the same thing's happening there. These people weren't always young in the first place. It's taken 20 years and the inevitable does come along. I think one of the big lessons from this really is how governments and large bureaucracies deal with their own failures. Admitting you've got it wrong, they're so reluctant to do that. Not just the post office, but if it's, HMRC dealing with tax problems or whatever, they're so reluctant to admit that they're wrong and the little guy's right for fear of all the extra work it will cause them, and they'll get hauled up in front of a public accounts committee or whatever. But you've got to hope that this scandal perhaps teaches them that actually you'd be better off admitting early on that there's a problem, that, in the long run.
The last time we spoke about this was in October, when you were telling us about the reaction that the post office had to finding out about the problems with Horizon. Are the big results expected from this inquiry? Are they going to be changed in any way by the huge focus there is on this now?
The inquiry is already finding out some amazing material. It's proven beyond doubt that the post office knew about these bugs at quite senior level, knew this system didn't work. It's proved that Fujitsu knew that. It's shown repeated lies by prosecutors, lawyers. So it really has unearthed some extremely useful detail. It's yet to get to the top people, though, and that will get interesting later this year.
Okay.
Paula Venables, for example, will be appearing, and she'll have to account for herself. And also, we shouldn't forget some of the executives from the early days or the earlier days of the scandal, the people who were in charge when the post office was part of Royal Mail, people like Adam Crozier. All these people set the culture of the organisation. They commercialised it rapidly. They reorganised it. They made the targets all financial, so that the chief executive's drive was just about turning a profit, which informed their approach towards shortfalls in branches, which in turn led to all the prosecutions. So the whole culture of the organisation over the last 25 years or so needs to be looked at, and that the inquiry should get to that eventually.
I've been radicalised by this story. I feel a bit about it like I do about the financial crisis when no one went to prison for it. I think when you look at the fact that all of these people...
Lots of people went to prison, Helen. Just the wrong people.
Just the innocent ones.
Yeah.
But you know what I mean? I think, because it's really interesting in terms of the drama, which is written by Gwyneth Hughes, and she said she wanted to write it like Avengers Assemble, but everybody who assembles is in an Austin metro, which I thought was a really great way of doing it. And it does have that kind of sweet... Because you're right, one of the things I think they do to them that's most appalling is say, no, this is an isolated problem, this has never happened to anyone else. And then there's a kind of really very emotional moment when people kind of get together and they realise, thank God someone understands what I'm going through. I'm not being a liar, I'm not a thief, someone believes me. And I think that's really extraordinary. But, the kind of drama has to deal with the fact there's very funny scenes where the big bad in the first episode is a sort of blinking computer tower. It's with just Horizon written on it.
It's quite Doctor Who with no budget at all for a baddie, so we'll just have an old computer.
But, I just think we do have this kind of culture where people earn enormous executive salaries, and that what you're supposed to be getting that salary for is that it's supposed to be a hard job that involves making difficult decisions and taking responsibility when things goes wrong. And we talked about this last time we had this on the podcast, about the fact that they sort of gave themselves a bonus for looking into it. I'm like, well done us, we've done really well.
But they thought that was them doing a good thing, because all their incentives, most of their incentives are how much profit the organisation makes. That's how they get the bonuses. So the theory goes that the executives only do what they're incentivized to do. Therefore, they've got to be incentivized to deal with this inquiry properly. So 5% or something like that, only a small amount of the current chief executive's bonus, Nick Reed, was driven by dealing with the inquiry properly. But it was so tone deaf, they didn't realise that when people cottoned on to this, and also the fact that they misled Parliament about how they'd dealt with the inquiry, that really rubbed it in. But, it was just, you want a bonus for dealing with an inquiry into a major scandal?